We have started. Joining me today is a very special guest, Romina Padró. Romina, for those who don't know you, can you say something about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I work at the Graduate Center, the Quine University of New York. I did my PhD there, and then I stayed working there at the Saul Kripke Center, and I'm the director of the center, so I work with Saul Kripke and trying to publish his unpublished work. And I also do research on the epistemology of logic, basically. That's my main interest, and it has been for a while.
Yeah, you've been interested in that in a while. I remember way back when taking one of my first logic classes. You were a student in that same class with me. I learned a lot studying with you during that class, so I certainly know you've been interested in this topic for a long time.
Yeah, we were there together. I remember. It's a long time ago.
It seems like another life, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your work, you say you're mostly interested in the epistemology of logic.
Yes.
But what's interesting, I think, about your work is that you want to focus on an issue which is not the sort of typical epistemology of logic type of issue, which is the justification of the kinds of basic rules of interest or something like that. So can you tell us, like, what aspect of the epistemology of logic are you interested in? Where is your work focused?
Well, I would say that in epistemology of logic, the question about justifying very basic inferences like most bonus or universal instantiation, it's true that it's not a subject that people have taken on a lot, but and that particular problem is a problem that people have been aware for a while and worked for a while. And my take on it is that we should have a clearer grasp before we try to justify these basic principles or rules about the inferential process itself and what is its nature, what is for us to make an inference, what's the connection that has to be established between the premises and the conclusion, and when you infer, like when you produce a most ponens inference, for instance. And I think that it's important that we deal with this problem before, because it will have the way we address it will have an impact on the way we would be able to justify the principles or rule themselves. And that's part of what I try to do, to show that certain accounts of the justification of the principles or the rules do not work, because their account of the inferential process itself seems not to work.
Okay. So you think we need to focus on what an inference is, what it means to make an inference, instead of starting from justification?
Yes, I think that the inferential process should be handled first, or at least, be clear about that. And then, because part of the reason why we are interested in justifying basic rules or basic principles is because we produce them, right? We use them when we reason according to them, right? So the question that immediately comes to mind is, if we cannot give a justification of these principles, because the main problem is that there's a circularity involved when you're trying to argue in favor of them, if they are really basic, you use them. And so the question is, how we are going to justify them given this kind of circularity. And the question that comes immediately to mind is, if we are not justified, we cannot give a justification, what happens with our uses? We are not entitled to them. We are not entitled to produce, So these two issues sort of come together, and the main reason for focusing on justification, I think, is that. But certain ways about thinking about the inferential process itself may change the way we approach this relationship that I just established between the entitlement and the justification problems. And it's hard to say. I mean, without getting into the problem, it's hard for me to say how they impact.
Well, let's get into the problem.
Okay. Okay. So the problem is, I call it the adoption problem. And it's based on an interpretation of Lewis Carroll note, what the tortoise said to Achilles. And the interpretation actually is an unpublished work of Saul Kripke. And he uses it for something different. And he gave a series of lectures on this in the 70s. And supposedly the first time he gave this, it was meant to be a course on Wittgenstein in the Wittgenstein book.
But he never got to it.
But he never got to it because he started talking about Putnam and quantum logic in that paper. I don't remember the name right now, but it's logic empirical. It has two names because I think afterwards it was changed. And so he was kind of upset with that paper and he started talking about it. And this is one of the arguments, perhaps the one that at least now he sees as the main argument against Putnam. And it's based on an interpretation of Lewis Carroll. So I don't know. I mean, should I say something about Carroll's note?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the standard interpretation of Carroll is that we need to distinguish between inferences and rules of inference or something like that. And that's something that you think that's not exactly the most useful lesson to take from that.
I mean, I think that that's part of the lessons that we can draw from it, but that's not the whole of the problem. And basically the note is a very nice note. It's very well written. It's only 3 pages, and it's a dialogue between Achilles and the tortoise. And so they are considering an argument, and the argument is things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. The 2 sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. And the 2 sides of this triangle are equal to each other, right? So the tortoise basically says, let's call each one A, B, and C. The tortoise basically says that whoever grants A and B need not read C if they don't grant the hypothetical. And the hypothetical will be something like, if A and B are true, C must be true, right? So she challenges Achilles to force her logically, she says, to accept the conclusion. And Achilles makes the mistake of agreeing to this challenge. And he also agrees to the idea that whoever grants the premises and does not grant the hypothetical is not under any logical obligation to reach the conclusion. So once we agree to that, right? Once we consent that we give the tortoise that, and her request, which is basically that the hypothetical be included as an extra premise of the argument, sort of makes sense, because if we think the hypothetical has to be granted, you can think of it as sort of working as an assumption of the argument itself, that you are making explicit by introducing it as a premise. Okay, so, you know, they are writing in a notebook, and Achilles includes this hypothetical as an extra premise. But then we have another argument that has, if A and B and C are true, then C must be true. But that's another hypothetical, so the tortoise asks again to introduce it as a premise, and it goes on and on in an infinite regress. So that's the basic structure of the argument. And yes, the main, people have drawn many different morals from this, but one of the points that most people agree on is that there's a distinction that needs to be made here between a rule of inference and a premise of an argument, and that rule of inferences cannot be included as premises of their own arguments. And once we separate both, supposedly, we should, yeah, I mean, many times it's also seen as a solution, right? Once you keep them separate. There are other interpretations. Some people think that it raises a problem about the justification of a most ponens inference, and other people think, I don't know, that there's a, really it sort of doesn't work, because if you assent to the premises and don't assent to the conclusion, it shows that you do not understand the premises.
Right.
And so,
I mean, it's so. Would you, before going a little bit further, do you think that that distinction is a solution in a sense? I mean, I know you think there's more to it than that, but is that some distinguishing between the rules of implication or inference and premises? Does that do anything? Because you might still think this question is still like there. Why should we? How could you logically force someone to accept the rules of inference? Or do you think that's a separate question?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, like the Torah school refused at that level too, right? If you think of it as a formal system, right? You can, she can say, well, you know, why would I accept this as a theory, as a rule of inference of this system? So it could be raised at that level as well. And look, I mean, I think that I don't think it solves the problem, keeping the distinction straight. Having said that, I think this is an important distinction to have.
Yeah.
Right. And even if it doesn't solve it, but it brings it out, and I think some people actually do that. They stress that this is part of it, but then there are other problems and why it's not solved. Saul's take on it is a bit different, because the way he approaches it changes the structure of the argument. Basically, the idea is that, and that's why I call it the adoption problem. The idea is that we're going to think about the argument itself as the exchange between the tortoise and Achilles itself, not in terms of someone that is kind of skeptical like the tortoise, but from the point of view of someone that has never inferred according to universal instantiation or most ponens. Actually, the case I use is universal instantiation. But you know, it works for most ponens as well. So what is the adoption problem? The way I set it up in the beginning is something like this. Certain basic logical principles cannot be adopted, because if someone already infers in accordance with them, no adoption is needed. And if the subject does not infer in accordance to them, no adoption is possible. So that's the setup. Saul never says what adoption is, and actually he's kind of annoyed that people use that term all the time. And and he doesn't think that that's something that one could do in terms of the way he's thinking about it, the adoption of intuitionistic logic, the adoption of quantum logic. And he thinks that the way of people assume that can be done is much more problematic. And he doesn't try to define it or make it more precise. But I do try to do that. So I said that the case is constructed from the point of view of someone that I call Harry, that does not infer in accordance to universal instantiation. He never produced an instance of a universal instantiation, and he has no notion of the principle or rule itself either. So he works at two levels. He doesn't know what universal instantiation is, and he never infers in accordance to it. So what do we mean by adopt? We are going to try to get Harry to adopt universal instantiation, this principle. And what do we mean when we say that we want him to adopt it? And the idea here is that we want him to pick up the UI principle in his practice. So that he develops a way of inferring in accordance to universal instantiation in his practice. By hypothesis, something that he didn't do before. But that has to be done on the basis of the acceptance of the principle itself that we are going to tell him. Okay? It's not just picking up the practice, that we train him to pick up the practice. No, the idea is that we state the principle or rule for him, and on the basis of that, he should be able to develop the practice to infer in accordance to that principle or rule. So
it's more than that too, right? I mean, don't you end up saying that it has to be encoded in a propositional format in his mind or something like that?
Right. I mean, and why do I set it up like that? Because the idea is that we want to see what's the work that these rules could or could not do in the context of an inference. And a lot of the positions in the epistemology of logic and justification of the basic principles simply assume that there is something rule-like going on when we infer, and something that like a rule that we have in our minds. There is not. It may not be something that we are aware of. It may be something it's not transparent to us, but there's a rule nonetheless that accounts for these inferential transitions. And I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense because you're trying to explain a capacity that is potentially infinite, right? And how do you explain this amazing capacity that we seem to have of actually producing many instances of universal instantiation if you don't appeal to some kind of rule that's guiding that?
Right.
And so it's an assumption that makes sense. And the idea of the adoption problem is to bring it into question. And for that, I use Harry's case. So the idea is that, look, I mean, I said before that most people will not assume that the rule is present in your mind in a very patterned way, but that is implicit, right? And so the idea is, what will happen if we give that to someone, not in an implicit way, but state it for him? I mean, it should work, because if it works implicitly, why wouldn't it work in the case of where we state it for him? Because here the idea is that even though it's implicit, you represent it and apply it in an implicit way, right? And so something like that should be able to happen with Harry, but it does not. And the problem is, I think, very simple in a way. One of the important things that I want to stress about the problem is that I see adoption as having like two phases. The first one is Harry's acceptance of the principle or rule, and the second one is developing the practice in virtue of that acceptance. So the case itself goes something like this. Suppose we want to help him and we tell him, look, you need to accept the following. universal statements imply each of their instances, or something like the predication of a property to all members in a domain entails that any particular member has that property as well. And so we may give a little bit of an explanation and say, that what we mean is simply that if some property applies to all the things we are considering, it follows logically that the property applies to each particular thing in the group. And we tell him not to worry, that the principle is always true, and he'll find it useful. And, he goes along and says, okay, I will accept what you're telling me. You seem to know a lot about this, so I'll go with it. And okay, so now we want to be sure that he has adopted, in the sense that I gave it before, universal instantiation. So we do a kind of test. And the example I give, it has to do with the movie Madagascar for some reason. So we tell him to read a review of the movie. And in the review, he says that all the animals in the movie talk, right? And this describes Alex the lion, which is one of the characters in the movie, as the most likable animal feature in the movie, something like that. A little description. So, and then we ask him whether Alex the lion talks. Since he read that all the animals in the movie talk, we would assume that he knows the answer to that question, right? But instead of saying, yes, Alex talks, he says, I have no idea. I told you I haven't seen the movie. So, we ask him, but, haven't you noticed that this review says that all the animals in the movie talk? And he says, yes, but you didn't ask me that, right? What you asked me was whether the Alex the lion talks. So by now we know that he has not adopted universal instantiation because he cannot make that connection, right? So suppose we try to insist a bit more, and we tell him something like, come on, Harry, we talked about this. You say that you would accept that all universal statements imply each of their instances. And, we think that perhaps we didn't give him enough information. We didn't tell him how a universal statement looks like. And maybe he just failed to recognize it as a universal statement. So we say something like, maybe you didn't know this, but all the animals in the movie Madagascar talk is a universal statement. They often have the form, all X's are P's, where the X's in this case are the animals in the movie Madagascar, and P is what we're saying of them, in this case, talk, right? And then we go on and say, as you have agreed, all universal statements imply each of their instances, and this particular universal statement, all the animals in the movie Madagascar talk, implies this particular instance, Alex the lion talks, since obviously a lion is an animal, right? But he's not convinced. He says something like, I never heard of a lion that is not an animal, and I believe you when you say that all universal statements imply of the instances, but I don't see the last thing, that I should be able to tell whether the lion Alex talks. Why is that? The review didn't say anything about the lion talking. Insist on that.
Poor Harry.
This is a universal statement. This is a particular universal statement, and this is a particular instance. Alex talks. You can see clearly that for him to recognize it as a universal statement, he really needs to instantiate, right?
Yeah. You were breaking up just a little bit there because the connection was bad. So can you just re-say what you were saying for a second?
Yes.
I got the tail end of it.
So what I was saying was that when you set it up like that, you can see that it's not the problem about lack of information, but that to recognize something like all the animals in the movie Madagascar talk as a universal statement, he already needs to be able to instantiate, which is, of course, what by hypothesis he couldn't do.
Right.
Right. And so, and obviously also recognize Alex the Lion talks as an instance of the previous universal statement, right? So basically, now he's in more trouble because he has to, he has the principle itself that we gave him, and he has to recognize an instance of it. And then he has to recognize an instance of that as Alex the Lion talks. So we have added an extra step, right? Which is basically to universal instantiate from the principle itself to the particular case that he wants to apply it, or that we want him to apply it to. So obviously nothing has been gained by our telling him the principle. And
so can I jump in and just ask you a quick question? Because before we go any further, I want to ask about Harry in particular. So you don't think there is anybody like Harry? This is a thought experiment, right? I mean,
it's a thought experiment, and actually it's meant to be sort of a reduction argument, right?
Right.
And that in a way, some positions make us, in a way, this is how I would put it. When you reconstruct certain accounts of the justification of the principles, you realize that on those accounts, something like Harry's situation would make sense, okay?
Right.
And the problem is that it does not.
Right.
And
and give just one more question about the Harry particular. So even in the case of the normal human development, you don't think this ever happened? So I mean, I assume a 6-month-old doesn't universally instantiate, can't do modus ponens. By the time they're 3 or so, they can. So isn't there a time when people can't do this, or what is your take on that?
No, I mean, obviously we learn to infer, right?
Right.
And but it's not an adoption process in the way I set up adoption as something that you go from the principle to the practice.
Right.
It sort of works out the other way around.
Yeah.
You pick it up in the practice, and some, not all, because a lot of people never wonder about these principles, and then learn them or state them or whatever. But it goes from the practice to the theoretical level, not the other way around. And I think that the other way around, when it comes to very basic ones, like universal instantiation, modus ponens, adjunction, it's very hard to see how they could possibly be adopted in the way I meant it, because any statement of the principle would need to use the principle itself for it to be applied. And this
is a bit of a non sequitur maybe, and not really something that you focus on, but I wonder what, if any, connection to the kind of argument that Fodor gave for conceptual innateness, that you can't acquire a concept, because in order to acquire the concept, you already have to have the concept.
I mean, there is a connection, and he actually talked about the connectives in a paper where he criticizes Peacock. And there are certain elements of that remind me of this problem. Mm-hmm. I don't think that innateness would really solve it. The problem is whether you're representing it or not and applying it. it doesn't really matter whether I tell it to you or you come with it or you have an intellectual grasp of it, like I don't know, rational insight,
yeah,
some view like that. It doesn't really matter as long as it goes from the propositional level, let's say, to the practice. It's very hard to see how that could possibly work.
So I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, I guess, but this is an interesting argument, because I know that in some places Saul himself seems pretty attracted to some kind of rational intuition view. It's never really clear. I guess lately, you said that lately he's become more of a Platonist. But your argument is that even if you were a Platonist, that wouldn't help you, because merely seeing that it's true, I mean, in a way, Harry already sees that it's true once you explain it to him. It's just he can't do it because he would have to sort of know how to do it in order to do it.
Right, exactly. I mean, yes, that's Saul is inclined to think that you sort of see it. And for me, like a rational intuition view of the inferential process itself and of this justification of the principles also would not work, mainly because of the following dilemma. You can have like two accounts. You have a rational insight of the principle or rule itself, and then because of that, in virtue of that rational insight, you develop the practice, or that guides you in your practice. You apply it and it guides you in your practice. That would be the similar situation as we telling Harry the principle, right?
Right.
Instead of rational insight, here we have us stating it for him. Now, in another possible view that I think it doesn't make a lot of sense, but would be something like the insight works with each inference. But then I don't see the point of actually appealing to rational insight, or you could just say, you know, this is what we do. This is what happens in the practice. It seems that if you, the whole point of appealing to rational insight was that it was going to give you the grasp of a principle that was going to explain all the applications that we do, right? All the particular inferences that we make that accord to that principle. And if we actually think that it's something that is going to work in a particular level, we lose that generality. And I don't see much of a difference between saying that and saying, well, that's how the practice goes, you know?
So if it's a case-by-case basis, then you haven't really given an explanation for the general practice. Is that something?
Yeah, that's part of the problem. And also, you know, what work is rational insight doing there, you know? And it just makes it more complicated and maybe even implausible that you have an insight with each particular case.
Right.
When doesn't really, you don't gain much with it. It would be just saying, well, we are disposed to infer this way.
Yeah. I wonder if the analogy with seeing is one that you often hear people that like rational intuition or you know, this kind of stuff talk about. You just see that it's true. But there's also a kind of going back to Plato. You know, I'm not a Plato scholar or anything, but you know, I dabble occasionally. But anyway, there's this kind of other metaphor of compulsion, that you're drawn, that you can't help it, that it's kind of forces you to act in a particular way. So I wonder if someone framed that the insight was not just seeing that it was true, but a kind of feeling compelled to affirm the truth of the instance, would that do anything for you, or no? They have the same problem?
I mean, I think it's the same problem as long as you have to sort of grasp the principle and apply it. If the compulsion is explained in those terms, then you have the same problem. And if it's not, and it's explained case by case, well, you know, in the first place, it's less plausible, right?
Yeah.
But still, you have the same problem of why postulate that there's some kind of rational insight to explain this compulsion. And also, you know, it's true that people are not very good in inference. And yeah, that there's a principle, that there's a rule that is working in a compulsive way. Well, yeah, maybe in certain cases, but there are a lot of cases where people are very content biased.
Right.
And if they don't like the conclusion, or the conclusion doesn't make sense to them, they would just think that the whole thing is invalid.
Right.
When it's actually not. It's hard. I mean, thinking about this, and if you ever taught Logic 101, abstracting the form of arguments is not something that comes very natural to people.
Right.
It takes a while to actually separate the two issues and seeing the form of the argument through the content. And people are, in general, you know, drawn to the content and make their evaluations on the whole argument in terms of whether they like the conclusion or not, or whether there's a connection between the premises and the conclusion, and they do not focus on the form.
Right, and that's something that's very, I mean, I teach a lot of intro logic, so that's a problem all the time. But even still, though, they're able to do it. I mean, you know, one of the surprising things, even to the students themselves, if you give them some argument just in natural language and say which ones are good or which ones are bad, even before you tell them about validity, soundness, or any of that stuff, for the most part, many of them are able to separate the good ones from the bad ones, and they don't know why. They just sort of, there's something about this one that seems right, or something about this one that seems like it doesn't go through.
Yeah, and even, you know, like when you give a kind of circular explanation of most ponens, or you say, well, you state the principle, and then you say, well, if the premises are true, and you have a conditional as the first premise, then you have the antecedent of the conditional, and then if you have that, then you have the conclusion. I mean, you are reasoning using most ponens itself,
right?
But even in that case, you seem to be saying something that they can make sense of, you know. But the point is that obviously in their case, they are not in Harry's situation, right? They have reason according to these principles. And one of the things that actually Saul points out, and I think is true, is that maybe stating the principle or the rule for someone that is an inconsistent inferrer will help, maybe, because they will have there will be a chance of them grasping the principle and applying it, right? But not for someone that is in the absolute darkness, like Harry.
Right. Yeah. So and Harry, would you? I mean, so I don't know how many of the other basic inferences Harry is or isn't able to make. So has Harry ever reasoned according to modus ponens, or? I
actually, when I think about a particular case, I grant the other principles, and so yeah, I assume that the problem is with universal instantiation most of the time, and think of him as kind of propositional guy. Moves at the propositional level. But you know, I mean, if you think about this, and this is something that relates to what Saul calls the formal system fallacy.
Yes.
You have a propositional system, right? So you don't have any rule like universal instantiation. That doesn't mean that if we think about it as an axiomatic system, you won't have to perform universal instantiations to be able to work with the axiomatic system, okay? Because all the rules and the principles, they are going to be formulated in a general way, so you obviously will have to apply universal instantiation even if it's not an explicit part of the system. And part of what Saul says not strictly in relation with this, but is that there's kind of an illusion that once we have the system, we just run with it, right? But actually, that's not the case. We need to reason about the system itself to be able to do anything with it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something that he calls intuitive reasoning or something like that. And that he sees as a kind of fiction, the idea that, you just adopt this axiomatic system and run with it. Because there will always be something that you need to presuppose in your reasoning, which our everyday reasoning, to be able to do anything with it. Yeah.
Right. So that's. I mean, I'm getting out of getting a little worked up here. There's a lot of interesting issues in what you were just saying. So, is the idea supposed to be that so this is what part of what I was going to ask about Harry was, if Harry's not able to make these kind of inferences, then is Harry not rational? I mean, he can't reason, or at least he's not fully rational. So is the idea supposed to be that there's a kind of intuitive notion of rationality and reasoning, and then formal systems are attempts to theorize or capture that, or what?
Well, those are like two separate issues. I mean, does someone like Harry even make sense? Well,
I couldn't talk to him. I don't know. I wouldn't know what to say.
Can he understand something like Alex is a lion, something as simple as that, without having universal instantiation? And, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. And that connects to the problem about understanding, right? Mm-hmm. Because I said that one of the points of one of the issues that some people have seen in the Carroll note is that the tortoise really doesn't understand the premises if she refuses to accept the conclusion. And here we could say something like, well, if he doesn't have universal instantiation, he's not going to understand your statement of the rule or principle either.
Right.
And in there, I would agree to that. But you sort of push back, because then what I'm going to say is, okay, but then the meaning of universal instantiation cannot be given in that way either.
Right.
Yeah. And there has to be something that precedes it in a way.
That's the intuitive notion.
You're not going to be able to acquire it in that way. And that actually, I think, it works against another very popular way of thinking about the justification of basic principles, which is in terms of rules for the introduction and elimination of the connectives. And here, the idea is that what explains our disposition to reason according to these basic principles is that there's a kind of acceptance of the rule itself that explains these dispositions. The acceptance doesn't need to be something, it's implicit, right? But it's working anyway. And we encode these rules in an implicit way and apply them. So if you think of the meaning constituting, for many of these views, I should say this, that's what is to have the connective, the concept of or to acquire the meaning, to know what it means, or to acquire the concept of the connectives, is to have accepted those introduction and elimination rules at some level.
Right.
Okay. So here the problem would be that it's the same, right? It's based in an act of acceptance that explains the dispositions to reason in that way. And I mean, I think that meaning constituting accounts have been not very explicit about how they work in terms of the disposition and rule relation. But think about it. If you don't think that the rules explain the dispositions, account for the dispositions, but that the rules merely describe the dispositions, you take it, then they're not really explaining the dispositions themselves. That is what we started wanting to do, right? And again, you know, I mean, like, it isn't much more than saying, well, we have this disposition and these rules are just a description of them. But it doesn't get to the core of the issue, that was, why do we have this ability and what explains this disposition to reason in this way? So, you know, I started saying that I thought that the inferential problem, the problem about what's the nature of our inferential moves, and when it comes to very basic rules, has an impact on how we see and think about the justification problem. And I meant this kind of issue, right? That if we think that mere acceptance of a rule is not going to be, it's not going to give you a good account of the inferential transitions, then positions like meaning constituting accounts or the rational insight start not to make a lot of sense. And even the connection between what I call the entitlement problem, you know, the idea that we are worried about justifying the principles or rules because we reason, we apparently reason in accordance to them. So are we entitled to those uses, to these inferential moves, if we cannot justify them? But here, if you start questioning that the rules themselves have a leading role to play to explain the inferential transitions, then the connection between the justification and the entitlement problem loses force.
Right.
Because part of the issue was, you know, like, I'm using this rule when I infer, right? But if that's not the situation, maybe the situation is something like the rule states or describes the practice, then the connection is not as firm, and it wouldn't seem that it's as pressing an issue to try to justify the rules themselves to account for our practice, because what we're leaning towards is that the practice is more basic, right?
Yeah.
And that the practice needs to be granted already for any statement of the principles to be of any use to anybody. That's and yeah.
So then we have less of a reason to ask for justification, because we've already started with the point that we use them all the time, and then we can state them.
Yes, I mean, or at least the entitlement problem,
right?
Because, you know, the question itself about what warrants, what entitles us to perform those inferences, will start losing weight, right? The practice needs to be granted for us to already. So does it make sense to think whether we are entitled to it or not?
Right.
We couldn't. Yeah, and then so that's part of the issue. And you know, I mean, even though I try to think about different positions on epistemology of logic, what really started this for Saul in the original seminars was the Quinean account,
right?
And which he takes to be the background epistemology of the Padró paper that he's attacking on quantum logic. The idea here is that if you think of the Quinean picture, he thinks that the logical laws are further statements in the system. You know, they are the core of the web, but there's no, in principle, any difference between that and very theoretical statements in physics or hypotheses. but Saul's point here is that if you think of the principles as mere hypotheses or statements that are in the system and that have work in pretty much the same way as scientific hypotheses, then you would be in a Harry-like situation. A Harry-like situation should make sense, and he should be able to reason, because think about how it works in the case of science. You have a hypothesis, you accept it, you bring it into the way of belief, and you make inferences on that, based on that. So here is that it should make sense, the idea that you can include a very basic principle of logic as a core principle and then infer in accordance with it, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, he has some funny passages about this in the seminars that I hope will be published at some point, because he says, like, I mean, part of the point also in Quine is that you can give them up, right?
Right.
And so he said something like, all crows are black, this crow is black, and let's suppose you want to give something like, you see a white one, okay, and you have, or a bunch of white ones, and you want to change that. So the idea here is that you have two options. You can give up the biological principle of the crows being black, or you can give up universal instantaneous. Like, do really people think that you have that option? Because, but in principle, it should make sense. Obviously, Quine has ways of avoiding minimum mutilation, and it will be much more disruptive. But in principle, it should make sense. And the whole account of the logical laws being just further statements in the system resembles the situation with Harry, where you just give someone a hypothesis and they should be able to infer in accordance to it. One point that actually Quine does not emphasize, but is pretty obvious, is that there's already a pretty striking difference between these statements and the scientific ones, because they not only are at the core of the web, they also make the web.
Right,
the web.
They bind it together.
Right, they hold it together. And so they have this dual role. And for the thing to make sense, and the idea of revision to make sense, once you drop the principle at the core, all the inferential transitions that it backed should go as well,
Right.
And so, yeah, basically the idea is that you include it, and as long as you have it, you can infer in accordance with it, and once you take it, you cannot. And that is consistent with a picture like Harry's, where, you just simply accept a statement of the principle. Yeah, so basically, people ask, because Saul used it to attack this particular way of revising logic, right? And people always ask me about the revision question. And this is not an issue that I like to talk a lot about. In the first place, because I don't think that we understand the inferential process itself. So we're trying to revise something that we don't even understand.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but what I would say is this: I don't know, Saul. Maybe Saul has a harder line on this, probably. But the way I think of this as being an argument against revision is not by attacking the revision per se, right? But by attacking the background epistemology on which you support your arguments for the revision, and you build your arguments for the revision, you know. So that's how I see it, as sort of indirect. But you know, I mean, if you think about people arguing for revision, they tend to go Quine, and now there are a lot of people talking about anti-exceptionalism, and which is Quine rebranded, basically.
Yeah.
And, but here, you know, I mean, like, I'm not saying the way they construct the idea of being exceptional, logic being exceptional, is not exactly the same way I am saying here that there's something special about these principles. Because what they stress is that it's a priori, all that. And really, it doesn't matter for the argument whether you have an a priori insight or not, as I already said. It's not a matter of there being a priori or not. It's a matter about the role that these principles can play in the inferential transitions. So the way it's special would be different. There's a question about what else would have this similar character, you know. And I think that that's something that you could think of separating the case of logic from the case of math.
Right.
Because if you state the principles for addition, whatever, there's in principle no reason why someone wouldn't be able to adopt that in the sense given. And there might be other cases. I don't know. I don't know about counting.
Can I ask you, just not to interrupt you, but can I ask you about that? So you think that if you give someone, you know, I don't know, take a simple example, like the piano axioms or something, some formalized version of arithmetic, that they should just be able to adopt that in a way that's not problematic, but they would have to understand the successor relation, for instance.
Well, that's my question, actually, whether they would be able to count and understand the successor relation.
Right.
For something like addition. So that would be, that's a question. I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
But wouldn't they need to understand that in order to adopt the practice?
Yes,
the rule?
if you grant that they can count, and you set the function, you know, I don't see why not. And the problem with counting, you know, there are a lot of issues there going on, and people's ability to grasp groups, equinumerosity, and so I tend to think that counting is something that we will have trouble teaching someone,
right,
in a very propositional way, not, you know, like we do with kids, like separating objects and like trying to do it, resemble the practice as much as possible to teach them. And once they have a grasp of that, maybe you can state the principles. But stating the successor operation and someone being able to grasp that, my inclination is to think that maybe not. Maybe that won't work.
And so I mean, because that was my intuition as well. I was, to me, it seems like in order to adopt a certain kind of arithmetic, you would have to grasp the successor function. But that already seems to sort of presuppose that you're able to add to understand what the successor relationship is. Unless you're just reciting a sequence,
yes,
how do you get to the next one without saying it's adding one to it?
Well, that depends in a way about how you account for the counting relation. I don't know, like for instance, for Brouwer, you needed time to be able to grasp. Talks about two oneness, like the two almost being more important than the one, because it's the passage from one to the other, where you actually see that separation, and then you are able to build the whole of the series. So I don't know. Do we need an experience of time? What do we need to be able to count? It's hard to say. It's not something that I really have worked on, but my intuition is with you that maybe not. Maybe stating the principles wouldn't be sufficient.
So in that way, then the adoption problem wouldn't be unique to logic.
Yeah, well, I mean, like there are other cases that I actually think that maybe we will have an argument, like acquiring the first person pronoun. And it seems that any statement of the principle would presuppose it, and that someone could not acquire, like the I from a statement. But yeah, those are, I don't know, identity is another case that I think may be problematic to explain to someone from a merely propositional point of view. But what I was trying to say in relation to the math case is that the issue here, why it would be special, why this one would be special, the case of logic, that it presupposes exactly the same principle itself, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what is important. Is that it's not the issue of the a priori, what will be separating it or not from other cases, right? And in that way, that will make the case of logic something separate from the case of math in terms of that, and I'm not treating them all together as the a priori cases.
Right.
And yeah.
But I agree with that, and I like the separation of the a priori. I think that's an important point. But I still think that in the addition case, you still have to presuppose addition in order to be able to do it, if that's bound up in the successor function. Understanding that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I actually consider the case of addition, but I presuppose that the person has the successor operation.
Right.
And so I don't know. Can you count without having any notion of addition? I don't know. I don't know. I would have to think more about that to say whether you really need to, so it wouldn't work for addition either. I don't know. I have to think about that.
Okay.
But with the case of counting, I think my intuition is to lean towards, that's not something that's something that has to be learned from the practice. That can be learned.
Right.
Yeah. Acquired, and yeah.
Then can I ask you about the intuitive notion of reasoning and that's in the background of all this? Because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like part of the problem, or not the problem, but part of the target here is not just adopting. I mean, that is the problem, obviously, but at least part of the problem is not just adopting a logic at will, but it's also trying to put pressure on the claim that maybe our sense of intuitive reasoning is non-classical. So sometimes when I read people like Priest and I talk, or J.C. Bill or these other kinds of guys that are arguing for non-classical version of logic, it seems like part of what they're trying to say is reason itself is non-classical, not just that we need a formal system that blocks explosion or something like that, but that it's wrong to assume that reason is a classical kind of thing, expecting the law of non-contradiction, and modus ponens is invalid in certain systems or whatever. But so it sounds like part of what you and maybe Saul too are arguing is that reason is a class. There's no way to avoid the intuitive reason itself being classical, or is that the wrong way of thinking about it?
Well, I don't know if I would put it in terms of classical logic, or because really we are talking about separate principles here, right? And not the whole classical logic. We are talking about.
Well, I meant in the sense of assuming contradiction and modus ponens.
Well, non-contradiction is a case where this would apply, right? the adoption would apply, but sort of in a different way, okay? Because let's say you state the principle of non-contradiction to someone that is not bound by non-contradiction because he has never inferred in accordance to it, right? And has no notion of the principle prior to our telling it to him. So because that person is not bounded by non-contradiction, the principle itself that you're stating to him, he could interpret it as holding and not holding, right?
Right. Yeah, this is the argument against Descartes, right?
Right, exactly. And yeah, so it's it works in a different way because to the principle itself, you make it not hold, and then you cannot infer or according to it. I mean, and so I don't know. I mean, in that case, maybe it would be it would make more sense to think that that it works against revision in a more direct way. But even Graham uses a sort of Quinean background to support his views on revision. So even if it didn't apply directly, I think it would be problematic. It's true what you're saying. I mean, like I said, I try not to talk about revision, and I sort of had a militant attitude towards it. But Saul talks about different ways that you could go with a revision, right? And he says, well, look, I mean, there are cases where if you want to be so pompous as to call that a revision, you could, like the case of Aristotelian logic, because they overlook the case where it was empty from all A's are B's to some A's are B's. And so if you think about that particular case, you can say, well, you know, I mean, like, it's not that maybe you will revise your logic. Maybe this is rare, but there will be cases, right, where it may happen, like in this case, right? But the whole point of what he's trying to say here is, look, this is not the case like the Putnam case, where you just say, look, there are some problems in quantum mechanics, so we drop this principle and adopt this other, and everything is going to be fine, and you don't understand any more than you did before why you have to drop one and move to the other. Here, in the case of the Aristotelian case, you have an intuitive argument about why, in that particular case, you overlooked something, right? And why it doesn't hold.
Right. The overlooking of empty names. Although I would just say that some people dispute that. I mean, some people claim that Aristotle knew about the empty name case. He talks about chimeras or whatever, but that he restricted the all imply some kind of thing to just ones that do actually succeed in naming.
Yeah. But I mean, independently of that, here the point is, you know, if you want to be inclusive and include the empty case, you can see clearly why that principle would be, that move would be problematic, right?
Right.
But if you read the Putnam paper, what he was trying to do is question the notion of self-evidence itself. He builds on the analogy with geometry, non-Euclidean geometries, and so, like, look what happened in the case of non-Euclidean geometries. Obviously, those principles seem self-evident to us, and they turn out to not to be the case. Who says that the same cannot happen in the case of logic, right? And so basically, what he's trying to do is attack the very notion of self-evidence,
right,
and then make it more plausible that we would switch for no particular reason. Yeah. other than, well, it would be more convenient to accommodate some facts about quantum mechanics. Well, this is a position that Pannon later on gave up, and I don't think a lot of people, try to. I don't think a lot of people try to give an account of quantum mechanics through logic anymore. Maybe quantum logic is interesting for other reasons, but not in the way we thought then. And
I mean, one of the things that I wonder about with Putnam, and this is not a genuine question, not as an objection or anything, but I wonder to what extent the difference is. So sometimes you hear logic talked about in two different ways. I mean, so for instance, going back to Aristotle seems to suggest that logic is kind of a theory about reality, that the non-contradiction.
We're gone for a second. So
what? Oh, was I gone for a second?
Yeah.
Am I back?
Yes, you are back.
Okay.
Repeat what you said.
So sometimes, for Aristotle seems to talk about the law of non-contradiction as a principle that describes the reality, the way things are. It's a metaphysical principle that, in reality, something cannot both be and not be the same way in the same way, blah, blah. But then other times it talks about as a psychological theory, which is the way we've been talking about it in terms of guiding inferential practices of human beings or animals. And sometimes I think the quantum mechanics debate, although I think you're right that it's been superseded, but sometimes I think what the debate there is reality like the way the non-contradiction says. So forget about the way we infer or the practices that humans have. What's the way metaphysically the structure of reality is? Does it reflect, is non-contradiction a good description of things out there?
Yeah. I don't know. What I would think is that I don't see how we can think without it. That's what I would say. I mean, like, any kind of intuitive reasoning seems to use it or presuppose it, or so. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we could think of reality in any other terms. I mean, you can have a formal system that drops non-contradiction or asserts that some contradictions are true. But from there to giving an interpretation of the system that actually makes sense to us, I think that there's a gap. It's kind of problematic. And, I mean, think about, for instance, the case of the intuitionists, right? It wasn't that you had first the formal system and then you gave it an interpretation, right? It was sort of the other way around.
Right, yeah.
And they thought that some ways of thinking about mathematics should be thought in terms of probability, and had an intuitive sort of meaning attached to the connectives in the way they proceed in mathematics. And from there, a formal system that tried to account for that was built, right? And maybe made it more precise, made the meanings more precise, and but there was already something there that was like kind of account of what we were trying to do, of the meaning of the connectives,
right?
In terms of probability.
And the same with relevance logic as well, would you say? Or it's different there because there's a dissatisfaction with the truth conditions for like material implication or something. So they try to build a system that accounts for that.
Yeah.
But there's an intuitive, I mean, if you any undergraduate in the universe would say there's an intuitive in which, these don't make sense.
Yeah. But in the case of something that like, drops some contradiction or asserts contradiction that are true, I don't know. I mean, I think it seems to me that it's problematic to reason that it would be subject to sort of the formal fallacy system, simply to assume that we don't have to do any reasoning about the system,
Right.
you know, that you can just run with it. And, you know, all this connects because this is funny. All this connects a lot with the Wittgenstein book on rules in private language. And we began saying that the course was supposed to be on Wittgenstein, right? And never got to be on Wittgenstein. But Sol never establishes the connection because the people there attending the course had never heard the Wittgenstein, the lectures on Wittgenstein, right?
That would be a problem.
They were actually given completely a couple of years later, and so he could not really say where the connection was from this problem to the Wittgenstein problem, because his take on it, you know, people didn't know, and. But, you know, a lot of this connects with the criticisms about machines in the Wittgenstein book.
Right.
There are also interesting differences and points of connection between adoption and the problem in the Wittgenstein book. Because if you think about it, problem there is about specifying the content of the rule, what the rule is, you know. You don't know if it's plus or task, and was, right? And so here the rule is completely specified, but you're unable to do something with it, anything with it, right? Because, I mean, something that we also brought up, and I didn't come back to, we said that one of the most popular interpretations of the Lewis Carroll problem is the separation between rules of inferences and premises in an argument. And here, what we have is that even if you give the stated as a rule for Harry, that wouldn't make any difference because he still will have to instantiate. I mean, for any rule-like thing that we could say to him, he would have to identify the conditions in which he would be able to apply the rule, right? So he would have to find an antecedent, right? And that's already presupposes universal instantiation. So he wouldn't be able to follow the rule because he can't identify where he has to apply the rule, really. And obviously also there's a problem about most opponents there. But so here what I was trying to say is you see that actually stating it as a rule does not make a difference, even if you think of it as an imperative that he gives himself. And the difference with the case in the Wittgenstein book, yes, is basically that here the content is completely specified. We are not presupposing that that he cannot have access to the content. The idea is even if he did, he wouldn't know how to apply it. And there's an interesting thing going on there because there are some formulations of what Sol calls the paradox, like in paragraph 3 of the Foundations of Mathematics, Wittgenstein's Foundations of Mathematics, and there, he goes through his example, which is not Sol's example, his example of adding 2 and changing and suddenly changing or something like that.
2002, 2008.
Yes, something like that.
Yeah.
And then he says, but even if you knew how if you knew the rule itself. How do you know how to apply it now? Even if you have this whole series, how do you know how to apply it now? And this is something that Crispin Wright and Bogosian make a lot of, as the paradox being not just about the content of the rule, but the very application of the rule, and in a particular case. Actually, Bogosian brings it up in connection with the inferential problem. The idea would be that any account of inferences will need to be given in terms of rule following, right? But rule following presupposes inference, so you have a circularity going on there. And they say, like, their point is like so missed that the problem is not just about the content of the rule, but the application of the rule itself that requires identifying conditions and being able to perform most ponens. And they see this as the central problem. I think that, look, I mean, Wittgenstein himself runs them together. And I think, and so too, I see them more as different ways of bringing the same issue. And the idea would be that the rule doesn't apply itself, doesn't just run on itself.
Right.
You need to give it an interpretation, that you need to identify the conditions in which it will apply. And there are maybe different ways of getting there, but they reach sort of the same point. So, yeah, when I thought about the connection between all this and the Wittgenstein book, in the first place, I was focused more on the differences. And but then I started seeing also points of connection between the two. And I think, yeah, that maybe there are different ways of reaching the same point. Actually, Saul has a footnote in the Wittgenstein book that he says, look, I mean, I don't know why he puts in a footnote, because it's an important point, very important point. Because he says something like, well, if the whole series had been given to you, you would still have a problem about when to pick the particular case, right? And he says something about, we presuppose that, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but we presuppose something about the infinite situation. But even if we grant someone that has all the steps, all the answers given, there will still be a problem. We can kick the ladder away that we used to build the problem. Something like that goes the footnote. So I think he's raising exactly this issue, and that he is aware of it, but he just thinks that there are two ways of getting in the same place.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So part of in the, Saul's alter ego, Wittgenstein, part of what's going on there at least part of what's going on there is seemingly the denial that we are machines. So would you say that's a fair way to characterize Saul's view, that humans? So I wonder if there's no formal system, it seems like, on his view, which is going to capture what we do when we reason intuitively, because all formal systems are basically machines, and we aren't machines. And you could object to that, obviously, but is that in the background of his thinking, do you think?
I mean, a lot of the Wittgenstein book is not him, right? And I don't think he would agree with the solution himself. And I think that probably if he had to go to go for some of the resisting positions, right, to the paradox, he would go for Platonism, even though this is a position he dismisses very quickly in the book.
Right.
because I think he thinks Wittgenstein does, right? But I think that there's a lot of agreement with Wittgenstein on the criticism of dispositionalism. I think that would be a point of, agreement to a lot of what he says. And you see some kind of connection. You see the connection here between his arguments against the machine account, right, of the dispositions, and his criticism of formal systems, because the idea would be that, you can't step out, right, and just pick it up and make it run, because the formal system, the machine, doesn't interpret itself. It will need someone doing the reasoning about the system, or the builder of the machine, all the arguments that he gives in connection to that. Now, about Wittgenstein himself, there's something that weird going on. I don't know if weird, but that I don't like going on. Because you can take the practice as primitive, and that seems to be something that we are leaning towards if we actually swallow the adoption problem, right? But what do we say once we agree to it, and we agree that it's an argument against all these positions that we were considering before? And one of the things that comes to mind is, well, you have to think more as kind of know-how, right?
Right.
And that also connects it with Ryle, because he uses this example of the Lewis Carroll, at least I think in the book or in the paper. Then he drops it, but the point here with the Wittgenstein account is that, in a way, it is, I don't know if we don't end up in that account seeing sort of machine-like, because you just react. And do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And
it becomes automatic, and that's the machine likeness.
Yes. And maybe that's why it was appealing to behaviorists like Ryle, And but I don't know if in the end he doesn't make us look more machine-like than we want it to be. If we follow other arguments about the hardness of the machine, and so that's a problem. And he says that you shouldn't talk about what is grounding that, right? But it ends up being like reactions, right? Which then you can say, well, that's what you call thinking, that's what you call inferring, and give an explanation of it. But at the base, there are just these impulses that remain unexplained. So I'm not sure what to make of it once you swallow the adoption problem. It seems clear that it leaves you in a not very comfortable position, because once you think that the practice is what is more primitive, a lot of questions, many questions start coming up, like, well, if we had a different practice, would we have different laws? And and what comes of the objectivity of logic? What comes of the normativity of logic? What kind of normativity are we going to be able to build up from here? And it's problematic. Yeah, I mean, because you can say, okay, you have to think of these basic rules in terms, at least in the beginning, as kind of know-how, right? Then you can develop propositional knowledge about that practice. But saying that you know how to infer is not saying much. What are you really saying?
Right.
How are you going to really construct that? And there are different ways you can do it. You can still, at that point, appeal to some kind of, I don't know, mental process that you have that connects. I don't know, think of something where you plug in the universal statement and delivers instances. But I really don't know if you try to explain that in terms of boxes that are not represented and applied, but they just work in your mind. I don't know how it's still at that point, you're not going to have the problem of actually what activates that, if not recognizing something as an instance of a universal instantiation.
So you get roughly the same problem, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I think people would deny that, but why does it get activated? What explanation to that can you give of why, when you confront the universal statement, then that goes through a particular case? And we have no idea about what is in there, in those boxes, right? What connects them, if it's something that is any similar to universal instantiation or something completely different. But so I'm inclined to think that that's not very helpful. And also, I mean, that would be a kind of description of the disposition itself, but I don't think that it would really explain it, of what goes on in the mind. Probably is my take on it is probably not for us to say, right? That there should be the research done
in the psychology department or
yes,
neuroscience department.
Yes. So
I mean, so it sounds like you're pessimistic about any real solution to the adoption problem.
I mean, I think that the solution is not something that can be solved in a way, you know. The question is what you do with it once you accept it. Because the point is fairly simple if you think about it. It's, of course, you can't adopt a universal statement because you will need to use it in any application of it. It's fairly simple. Now, one point is how you interpret it, and here the idea is, well, you know, it runs much deeper, this circularity, than people have allowed themselves to think.
Right.
And it's something that shows up in the justification problem, but that it really lies beneath it at the inferential level itself. And so once you think in those terms and you start thinking about the inferential moves themselves as something that is not rule guided, how do you account for them? What's the role that those rules, once stated, are going to have? And kind of what I was trying to think is, well, trying to think in terms of something like the intuitionistic case, that there has to be something in the practice itself already, and meaning that maybe it's not completely fully defined, but it's going to be made more precise when you state the rules.
Right.
And but that is already there, and that the inferential moves are already there. And then once stated, then you can think that there is an interaction between the practice and the theory, right? That the theory doesn't have just to be a mere description of the practice, but that can come back to the practice and have some kind of normative role as well.
Yeah, some reciprocal feedback.
Yes, something like that. But this obviously is not the same as the original normativity that we were talking about. And you have to deal with this problem of explaining how is it that we react in many, many, many cases to universal statements in this way without appealing to a rule. So, yeah, I mean, that question is still pressing in a way. You have to say something about that. And I'm not sure that just appealing to the practice itself will be sufficient, to actually give an adequate explanation. So as I was saying to you before we started, I feel that I've been led to an uncomfortable position, but a position I did not want to get to. And that, which is basically that, swallowing that the practice has to be the most primitive thing, and that we can't think of the inferences in a purely rule-regulated way. Yeah.
So, I mean, just to sum up the stuff, it seems that there's some similarity to the problem of induction. The idea of Hume's problem of induction sometimes is put that you have to rely on induction in order to rely on induction. To justify induction, you have to rely on induction. So the practice of induction seems, in some sense, already you can't describe it without already invoking it. Do you think there's a similarity between Hume's problem, or do you think they're not that similar?
I mean, at the level of justification, I suppose, yes. At the inferential level, I don't know. I have to think, because this case wouldn't even apply to all the laws, in classical logic. So, in particular, in the Putnam case, it wouldn't apply directly to the distributive law, right? So what are you thinking at the inferential level? What would be, because in the justification it's clear that you have to appeal to it to justify it, but when you are inferring, why would it be similar?
I mean, so in the case of, like, all swans are white or all crows are black, that's an inductive generalization that you reach by inferring from particular cases. So I guess it'd be, this swan is white, that swan is white, and eventually you get to the point where you infer that all swans are white. So there's a sense in which building up the inductive generalization requires already the very inference that you're trying to perform, namely recognizing that these are, instances of the generalization.
But why would that be something that requires induction? Wouldn't that require, like, instances of the generalization universal instantiation or something like that?
Right, yeah. So, but
I mean, like, obviously you need to presuppose something like the principle that of constancy, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, I mean, I think there are similarities between the two cases. I'm not sure that it will work in the same way at the inferential level, but I have to think about it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right now that I'm hearing myself say it. I think you're probably right about that. Okay, well, I can't keep you here forever today, although I'm having a great time talking with you. But I wonder, so if there's anything that we haven't talked about yet, which you would like to bring up.
Ah,
And the answer can be no.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, like, well, there are a lot of, obviously there are a lot of details and things that I cover very quickly. But I think that pretty much in terms of the whole structure of how I see the problem, we cover pretty much everything and where I end up. But yeah, I mean, like, obviously there are details when you approach particular cases of rational intuition accounts, and then you have to think how the argument will work in each particular case, or you have different accounts of meaning constituting accounts that maybe are mixed things, are part rational inside. So you have to adapt to those cases. And even in the Quine case, I was saying, trying to link the Quine epistemology of logic to what the people now call anti-exceptionalism. But there are also differences, and obviously they make distinctions like that Quine didn't make, and that they're very clear between the principles and the rules that connect the web, and all that. You have to adjust to see how it will work in each particular case. But I think in terms of the structure, we cover pretty much everything. I didn't talk about Descartes explicitly because yeah, that's another case that actually applies sort of this argument, not exactly in the same way, but I think that pretty much we cover everything. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending this time talking with me. I learned a lot, as I always do, from interacting with your work. So I guess I'll talk to you later. Just stay on for a second. I'll talk to you afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. It was great talking to you.